Millionaire hired a mute maid for his son, but what he discovered days later left him speechless. David Harrison sat alone in the spacious, dimly lit study of his mansion, the faint hum of the air conditioner mingling with the occasional clink of ice in a glass of whiskey. His fingers drummed nervously against the sleek surface of his desk, but his mind wasn't on the papers in front of him, nor on the latest tech acquisitions that had made him a multimillionaire. His thoughts were elsewhere, swirling in the uncharted waters of a personal crisis that had consumed him ever since his wife, Sophia, passed away 3 years ago. Sophia's death had shattered the fragile equilibrium of their family. She had been the glue that held everything together, the one person who could coax a smile from Max, their only son. Now, in her absence, David was finding it increasingly difficult to bridge the gap that had formed between him and the teenager. Max, barely 18, had become a stranger in his own home. The bright, curious boy who once asked endless questions about the world and his father's business was gone, replaced by a sullen, aloof young man who barely spoke. It was as though the death of his mother had stolen more than just her presence. It had taken Max's ability to connect, to feel, to care. David leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and closed his eyes for a moment. He had always been driven, relentlessly so. Building his fortune had been a task that consumed every ounce of his energy. He had sacrificed family time, often choosing meetings and deals over family dinners, late nights at the office, instead of attending his son's soccer games or school events. He had assumed that his wealth, his success, would make up for the absence of his time. But now, sitting in the silence of his grand home, surrounded by reminders of his achievements, David felt hollow. His wealth meant nothing when his son was slipping further away, unreachable behind walls of silence and resistance. For years, David had tried everything he could think of to reach Max: counseling, private tutors, even attempts to reconnect through shared interests. But each effort was met with indifference or outright rebellion. Max had grown distant, and no amount of money or gifts could break through the barrier that had formed between them. David rubbed his temples, a feeling of failure gnawing at him. He had built an empire, but he was failing as a father. The thought gnawed at him, a constant ache in his chest that no amount of business success could soothe. He couldn't undo the years of neglect, but perhaps there was a way forward. David had been thinking about it for weeks, searching for an answer that would bring Max back. After much deliberation, he had come up with a plan that seemed absurd at first, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the only hope left. The door to his study creaked open, and his assistant, Sarah, stepped inside, breaking him from his thoughts. She was holding a file in her hand, but David barely glanced at it. He had no interest in business right now. "David, I have the information you asked for," she said, her voice calm but tinged with concern. "I found the candidate." David nodded absent-mindedly, motioning for her to place the file on the desk. He wasn't looking for an assistant. He wasn't even looking for a solution to his business problems. What he needed now was someone who could help him with Max, someone who could help him break through to the son he was losing. The file contained the details of Lena, a young woman in her mid-20s who had been mute since a traumatic experience in her youth. Lena's story was mysterious, and there were rumors about her past that David didn't know and didn't care to know. What mattered was that she didn't speak. She communicated through gestures and expressions, a language David believed could bridge the emotional gap between Max and himself. The idea was simple. If Max couldn't speak to Lena, perhaps he could feel something again. Perhaps Lena's presence would force him to confront the grief, the anger, the confusion that had taken root in his heart. Without words to hide behind, maybe Max would finally open up. David had arranged a meeting with Lena a week ago, and now the final decision had been made. Lena would begin working as a live-in maid, responsible for caring for the house, but more importantly, for providing Max with the subtle, non-verbal presence that David believed might help ease the tension at home. "I think this could work, Sarah," David said, his voice heavy with a mixture of hope and desperation. "I have to try something. Maybe Lena is the answer we've been looking for." Sarah raised an eyebrow, uncertain. "Are you sure about this? Hiring someone who can't speak, it's unconventional to say the least." David let out a long sigh, his eyes dark with exhaustion. "I don't know if it will work, but I have to try. I can't just keep sitting here and watching Max drift away." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "I'll make sure everything's ready for her arrival." As Sarah left the room, David turned his attention to the large portrait of Sophia that hung above the fireplace. He hadn't been able to bring himself to take it down, though sometimes, when he was alone in the house, he'd stare at it for hours, wishing for one more conversation, one more moment of guidance. Sophia had always known how to make their family work, how to keep the balance, even when David's work consumed him. She had always known how to reach Max, how to make him laugh, how to melt his stubbornness with the simplest of gestures. David's gaze softened as he thought about her. "I'm sorry, Sophia," he whispered, as if she could somehow hear him. "I've failed him, but I'm going to fix it. I have to." The next morning, Lena arrived at the Harrison mansion. She was a quiet presence, her dark eyes betraying little emotion, but there was an intensity to her that made David hesitate for just a moment. He hadn't anticipated the weight of her silence until he saw her in person. She moved through the house with an almost ethereal grace, her soft footsteps barely making a sound on the polished floors. She had a mysterious air about her, and though David couldn't quite place it, he felt an odd sense of comfort in her presence. She didn't speak a word, but somehow it felt as though she understood the tension in the house, the unspoken rift between father and son. Max was still asleep and Lena didn't disturb him. She simply went about her tasks, preparing breakfast with careful precision, moving like a shadow. David watched her for a moment, wondering what she would bring to the household, wondering if this was the beginning of something that would change everything, or if it was just another attempt at a solution that would fall short. But for the first time in years he felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was the first step toward bridging the chasm between him and Max. Lena's arrival at the Harrison mansion was a quiet event, marked by her subdued presence. She didn't announce herself with the usual bustle that came with new employees, no words or grand introductions. The subtle click of the front door, as she stepped inside, carrying a small bag and a few belongings, was the only sound that disturbed the still morning air. David watched her from the doorway of the grand living room, his arms crossed over his chest, his face an unreadable mask. He had hoped for a change, for something to reach Max where his own efforts had failed. But now, as he observed Lena standing there silent, calm, almost ghostly in her poise, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach. Max, who had been lying on the couch with his headphones on, didn't acknowledge Lena at all. His body was turned slightly away, as though deliberately avoiding her, his face obscured by his messy dark hair. He didn't even bother to look up when Lena entered the room, his focus entirely on the screen of his phone. David, feeling a pang of frustration, tried to engage his son, but Max only muttered an indistinct response, the familiar indifference hanging in the air. Max had always been dismissive of anyone who tried to offer him comfort, but David couldn't help the surge of disappointment that followed. Lena, however, was undeterred. She stood still for a moment, scanning the room as though reading the atmosphere itself. The stillness around her was almost tangible, her presence unintrusive but commanding in its quiet way. Slowly she moved to the corner of the room, where a vase of fresh flowers stood. She adjusted the arrangement with delicate hands, making sure the flowers were perfectly aligned. It was such a simple act, yet it felt deliberate, as though she was asserting control over something in the space without saying a word. Max continued to ignore her, but David could see something subtle in his son's posture. There was a slight tension in the way he sat, as if the act of being ignored, of being unacknowledged, was beginning to gnaw at him. David couldn't help but wonder if Lena's presence was doing something to him. Some quiet disruption beneath the surface, stirring emotions Max had long kept buried. The day passed in relative silence, with Lena moving through the house with a quiet grace, her actions slow and methodical. She never spoke to Max directly, but she seemed to be aware of him in ways that were uncanny. When she set the table for dinner, she placed his plate in front of him without asking, anticipating his need before he could even acknowledge it. She would pause for just a moment, her eyes meeting his, as though offering something unspoken, a challenge, a question, an invitation. Max was stubborn, though. He never took the bait. He ate mechanically, his mind still locked behind the walls he'd built after his mother's death. David watched, unsure of what was happening, but strangely hopeful. Maybe it was the silence itself that was making a difference. Maybe Max would respond to the lack of pressure, to the absence of words that had so often caused him to recoil. It was a week later when David noticed the first subtle shift. Max was sitting on the porch one afternoon, sketchbook in hand, but abandoned on the table beside him. His gaze was distant, his fingers lightly tracing the edges of the pages, but he wasn't drawing. He hadn't drawn in years, not since Sophia had passed. Lena, as usual, was nearby, working quietly. She moved past Max, her soft footsteps drawing his attention, but she didn't stop. Instead, she slipped something onto the table next to him, an envelope. It was simple, handwritten in delicate, flowing script, but the message inside was short and to the point. Don't let the past steal your future. Max's eyes lingered on the note for a moment, a flicker of something passing across his face. For a second, David thought he saw a hint of recognition, something that suggested the words had found a crack in Max's armor. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Still, Max didn't say anything. He didn't even look at Lena as she passed by again, silently resuming her tasks. But David saw the subtle change in his son. The walls hadn't come down entirely, but there was a small opening, a tiny crack, through which something human had seeped in. Over the next few days, Lena continued to leave notes for Max. Each one was different, each one simple yet profound in its quiet encouragement. She never spoke directly to him, but her presence spoke volumes. One morning, as Max was slouched on the couch, brooding over the latest issue of a graphic novel, Lena left another note on the armrest beside him. The best way to honor what we've lost is to create something new. The words were gentle, almost tender, yet they carried the weight of something much larger, something that resonated deeply with Max's own sense of grief. David could see it in the way Max's fingers hovered over the note, the way his posture seemed to shift, as though the words were pulling him out of the dark fog he had been living in. David, watching from a distance, wondered if Lena understood the gravity of what she was doing. How did she know that Max had once loved to paint? How did she know that it was painting that had given him comfort in the days before Sophia's death, when he had still believed in the future, still believed in possibility? Max had abandoned his art the moment his mother had passed. He'd thrown away his brushes, his paints, his canvases. He'd locked away the part of himself that had once been so full of promise and expression. David had always blamed himself for not pushing harder, for not noticing how deeply the loss had affected Max. But now, as he watched Lena's silent interventions, David began to wonder if this was what Max needed all along. Not a confrontation, not a forced conversation, but a quiet invitation to remember. The next day, as David passed by the studio on his way to his office, he stopped in his tracks. The door was ajar, and inside, Max was sitting in front of a canvas, his hand poised over a set of paints, just staring at the blank surface. It was the first time in years that he'd picked up a paintbrush, and David felt a flutter of hope in his chest. But what truly struck him was the way Lena was standing in the corner of the room, watching Max. She didn't say anything, didn't give any kind of direction. She simply stood there, her expression unreadable, but there was a tenderness in her gaze that spoke volumes. Max didn't notice her at first. He was too lost in the task of trying to remember what it felt like to create again. But slowly, as he picked up the brush and began to mix colors, he glanced up at Lena, meeting her eyes for the first time since her arrival. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the silence between them was a language all its own. Max gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before returning to the canvas, and for the first time in a long while, David felt as though his son might just be beginning to heal. Not because of anything he had done, but because of the silent connection that had been forged between Max and Lena. It was a bond that needed no words, only understanding, only presence. And in that silence, David found hope. The afternoon sun was shining through the large windows of the Harrison mansion, casting a dreamy glow over everything. The whole house was quiet, as if resting, preparing for a long night. David sat in his office, his tired eyes following the computer screen, but his mind was not there. He had too much unfinished work, too many meetings still waiting, but all he could think about was Max, the son he had lost contact with since his wife Sophia passed away. Max, now an 18-year-old young man, was perhaps the only person in the house who made David feel helpless. He did not know what to do to pull his son out of the quagmire of sadness and suffering. Max had always been like that, lonely and withdrawn, never sharing his feelings, not even with his own father. The feeling of failure lingered in David's heart every day, and no matter how hard he tried, nothing could make Max change. Then one day, Lena came, and everything seemed to change, at least somewhat. Lena was not like the other servants in the house. She came with an indescribable silence. Just as David had requested, she did not say a word when she arrived, no greeting, no introduction about herself. She only brought with her a small bag, inside which were a few personal items and a pair of deep, secretive eyes, as if containing a whole world that no one could easily explore. Max, as usual, did not bother to care about her presence. He only glanced at her once and then returned to his phone, staring at the screen. Max didn't notice Lena enter the house, didn't see her as she quietly went about her business, cleaning, mopping, and sometimes just standing still, staring out the window as if contemplating something. David watched Lena from afar, and there was something about the way she moved, about her calmness, that he couldn't help but feel strange about. It wasn't her quietness, but the way she held space for Max, not forcing, not demanding, just a gentle presence. Though Max didn't respond, David could feel the change in the air whenever Lena was around, and gradually Max stopped completely shunning her. A week passed, and it seemed like nothing had changed. Lena was still a silent part of the house, doing little more than maintaining the quiet and peaceful presence that Max seemed to be beginning to acknowledge, even if he didn't say it. Then one evening, after dinner and the family sitting quietly in the living room, Max suddenly asked Lena a question, unlike any he had ever asked before. "Lena," Max began, his voice low and hesitant, why didn't you say anything?" David happened to be nearby, sitting behind the couch, and heard this question. The uneasiness in his heart grew. Although Max had asked Lena a few times about simple things like her job or hobbies, this was the first time he asked about the reason for her silence, about herself. Lena did not answer right away. She quietly took out a small notebook from her bag, wrote something with a pen, and handed it to Max. He stared at the words written in delicate handwriting. "I've been hurt a lot. The person I love made me silent." Max looked up at Lena, his eyes expressing no emotion, but in his gaze was understanding, a sympathy that he had not felt for anyone for a long time, even for himself. Max, without saying a word, just silently read the words again. David stood at a distance, his heart aching. He did not expect Lena to have such a painful past, but a part of him felt closer to her, because her silence was like a mirror reflecting his own emotional blockage. He had also kept himself silent, not telling Max about the pain he had suffered from losing Sophia. He had also withdrawn from his son, locking himself in his worldly successes instead of facing his family's pain. In the following days, the relationship between Max and Lena began to change. Max, though quiet, tried to open up to her more. He began to open the old sketchbooks that he had forgotten about before, the unfinished drawings that had been his passion. Lena said nothing, just stood and watched, occasionally clapping her hands when Max drew a satisfactory stroke. One rainy afternoon, when the wind blew strongly through the window, Max sat at the drawing table, holding a brush in his hand, but not drawing anything, just staring at the white canvas. He began to write on a small piece of paper and gave it to Lena. The neat words appeared, "I don't know how to start again." Lena looked at the words for a while, then picked up a pen, wrote on another piece of paper and gave it back to Max. "Let things be natural, no need to rush." Max, saying nothing, just sighed. But this time something in his eyes changed. It wasn't despair anymore, but a small hope that began to flicker. It was the first time he had drawn again, a simple picture of a bridge, incomplete but meaningful. David stood in the doorway watching this scene, and for the first time he felt a strange feeling pass through him. Hope. Max, his son, seemed to have started to come closer naturally, although there were still many wounds that had not healed, but perhaps those wounds would no longer torment him. And it was Lena's silence, the wordless patience she brought, that helped Max touch the emotions he had forgotten for the past 3 years. David didn't know what would happen next. But one thing he was sure of, Lena, with all her silence and gentleness, had created an indescribable connection, a bridge between two worlds that seemed to have lost all connection. That bridge was gradually becoming stronger, a stroke, a tear, an unspoken word. The days stretched lazily into weeks, and with each passing moment the delicate bond between Max and Lena deepened in subtle, unspoken ways. The house, once echoing with silence and unspoken tensions, now carried a quiet, almost sacred energy. The atmosphere had shifted, a calmness that David couldn't explain, yet couldn't deny. It wasn't just Lena's quiet presence anymore, it was the way she had become an almost silent observer of Max's inner world, drawing him out in ways that David himself had never been able to. Every morning, after breakfast, Lena would retreat to the small studio room at the back of the house, where Max had taken to spending hours at his easel. The room was sparse, with just a few canvases leaning against the walls and a table cluttered with brushes, paints, and half-finished projects. But Max had started returning to it, rediscovering something that had once been a source of joy for him: painting. At first, it had been out of necessity. Lena encouraged him to pick up his brushes again, to express himself. But soon, it became more than that. Max found a kind of solace in those moments. Lena would quietly sit in the corner of the room, her eyes following his every stroke, offering encouragement with a soft smile or a gentle gesture. She rarely spoke, but her presence was enough. Over time, Max found himself opening up not just to Lena, but to the vulnerability he had buried beneath layers of resentment and pain for so long. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Max set his brush down and looked at the unfinished canvas in front of him. The image he'd started a bridge stretching across turbulent waters wasn't complete, but it felt significant. He didn't know why, but it did. Lena, who had been seated in her usual spot by the window, caught his eye. Her expression was soft, patient, as if she were waiting for him to speak. Max hesitated. It had been a long time since he'd shared his thoughts with anyone, especially not about his art. But there was something about Lena's stillness, her unspoken understanding, that made it easy to trust her. "I don't know if I can finish this," Max said, his voice low but tinged with frustration. "It doesn't feel right." Lena rose from her seat, walked over to where Max was sitting, and gently touched the edge of the canvas with her fingers. She nodded, her eyes meeting his, and then, with a fluid motion, she picked up a brush and dipped it into the paint. Without a word, she began to add a few strokes, her movements confident and sure. Max watched, mesmerized by how easily she worked, as if she had an innate understanding of what the painting needed. The brushstrokes were soft but deliberate, adding depth to the water, softening the harsh lines of the bridge, making it blend more harmoniously with the scene. When she finished, she stepped back, giving him a small smile. The silence between them felt different now. It was no longer heavy with awkwardness or uncertainty. It was comfortable, almost intimate. Max felt a strange flutter in his chest. He couldn't quite explain it, but he found himself drawn to her in a way that went beyond the quiet companionship they had shared so far. There was something in the way Lena moved, in the way she saw him, something gentle, something he had longed for but never knew how to ask for. It wasn't just her kindness that touched him, it was the strength that lay beneath her silence. She had a quiet power, one that made him feel safe, understood, and wanted. David, however, could not ignore the growing undercurrent between his son and Lena. He noticed the little things, the way Max would look for her after dinner, the way they'd sit together in the studio, silent but content. He saw the way Lena would smile at Max, or the way Max's shoulders would relax when she was near. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but David, who had spent years observing his family, could sense the change. He tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on work, on the demands of his business, but the feeling lingered, creeping into his mind when he least expected it. Max, his son, was falling for Lena. He wasn't blind. He saw it in the way Max's gaze softened whenever she entered the room, in the way his posture changed when he spoke to her, in the way he sought her approval, her attention. And that was the part that unsettled David the most. He wasn't just watching Max grow closer to Lena. He was beginning to recognize that he too had grown drawn to her. It wasn't just gratitude anymore, or even fascination with her quiet wisdom. There was something else, a tenderness in her gaze, a kind of quiet understanding that he hadn't even realized he'd needed. It wasn't that he thought Lena would replace Sophia, no one could, but there was an unspoken bond forming between them, one that was both comforting and disorienting. David felt a mixture of emotions that he wasn't prepared to confront. The more he watched Lena and Max together, the more he found himself questioning his own feelings. There was a part of him that felt protective of both of them, wanting to shield Max from any heartache, wanting to protect Lena from whatever it was that made her so broken. But there was also a growing attraction to Lena, one that made him uncomfortable. He didn't know what to do with it. One evening, after dinner, when the house had quieted down, David found himself alone in the living room. The soft glow of the lamps cast long shadows across the room, and the sound of rain tapping against the windows filled the silence. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, trying to steady his nerves. As he sipped the drink, he heard soft laughter coming from the direction of the studio. It was faint, but it was enough to make his heart tighten in his chest. He set the glass down on the coffee table, the sharp clink of the glass breaking the silence. The image of Max and Lena, sitting together in the warm light of the studio, their heads bent over a shared project, flashed in his mind. He could picture it so clearly, Max's easy smile, Lena's quiet presence. They looked so comfortable, so natural together. It was a bond that David hadn't expected, but now that it had formed, he wasn't sure how to navigate it. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, trying to clear his mind. He had to do something, say something, before things got more complicated. But what could he say? How could he talk to Max about this? And more importantly, how could he address the strange, undeniable pull he felt toward Lena? Later that night, David stood by the window in his bedroom, staring out into the darkness. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a cold, damp stillness. He could see the lights from the studio room across the yard, faint and warm. He knew Max and Lena were still in there, still sharing that quiet, unspoken connection. David couldn't stop thinking about the tension building inside him. There was a part of him that wanted to protect Max from getting too close to Lena, that wanted to shield him from the inevitable heartbreak that could come with falling in love. But there was another part of him, one that he was afraid to acknowledge, that wanted to keep Lena close, wanted to understand her more, to know why she had become such an integral part of their lives so quickly. It wasn't just her silence anymore. It was everything about her, the way she moved through the house with a quiet grace, the way she seemed to read people without saying a word, the way she made Max feel safe. The connection between them was undeniable, but it was also dangerous. David wasn't sure he could stand to watch it grow any deeper. Max was growing, and Lena was a part of that growth. But so was David, and the part of him that was beginning to feel more and more drawn to her was something he couldn't ignore, no matter how much he tried. The tension between them all was reaching its peak, and David wasn't sure how long it would take before everything, his family, his emotions, the fragile threads of their connections, unraveled. The evening air was heavy with the scent of rain, a coolness settling over the estate as David wandered through the large, empty hallways of his home. It had been a long day at the office, full of meetings that drained him, and when he returned home, he was met with the usual quiet. Max was in his room, no doubt lost in his art or in some other world that David couldn't fully reach. Lena, as always, was somewhere in the house, attending to her tasks with that quiet grace that both comforted and unsettled him. For the past few days, David had been struggling with his thoughts. His relationship with Lena had become something more complicated than he had expected. There were moments when he caught himself lingering in her presence a little too long, when his gaze lingered just a moment too long on the soft curve of her smile, or the gentle way she moved about the house. And then there were the moments when he saw the connection growing between her and Max. He didn't know what to make of it all, his son, falling for the silent woman who had come into their lives so mysteriously. But tonight, something was different. As he passed by the study, he noticed a faint glow under the door, a sign that Lena was still awake, working, perhaps reading through her notes. David hesitated. He knew that he had to talk to her, that there was something he hadn't yet asked her, something he needed to know. The unease had been building inside him for days, and now it seemed as though the moment had come. He knocked lightly on the door. "Lena," he called, his voice tentative. There was a pause, then a faint rustling from inside. The door creaked open, revealing Lena standing just beyond it, her face calm but unreadable. David tried to ignore the sudden jolt in his chest, the way his heart seemed to quicken whenever he was near her. Instead, he focused on the task at hand. "I need to talk to you," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Lena gave a small nod and stepped aside to let him in. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a lamp on the desk, casting long shadows across the walls. The scent of lavender hung in the air, mixing with the faint smell of the rain that had soaked the earth outside. She had her notebook open in front of her, a few words scribbled on the pages, but she hadn't been writing. She had been waiting, perhaps knowing that this conversation was inevitable. David took a deep breath, his mind racing with the questions he had yet to voice. "I've been thinking a lot, Lena," he began, his voice low. "About you. About your past. About what you're running from." Lena's face didn't change. Her eyes, though, seemed to darken, as if she were suddenly bracing herself for something. "I know you're here to help Max," David continued, his words tumbling out more quickly now. "And I know you've been good to him, but I need to understand, who are you really, Lena? You've been hiding something. I can feel it." The silence between them was thick, heavier than the rain falling outside. For a long moment, Lena didn't respond. She just stared at him, her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes unreadable. Then slowly, she reached for the notepad on the desk and picked up the pen. She wrote something, then turned it to face David. "I'm not who you think I am." David felt a chill run through him. His heart began to race. He had known deep down that something wasn't right. But this, the words written in front of him, this was more than just a simple secret. There was something beneath the surface, something dark, something dangerous. Lena's fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the pen again. She hesitated before she began to write once more. "My name is Lena Davis. I was once engaged to a man involved in illegal dealings. I had to escape him, escape the law. I've been running from my past ever since." The words hit David like a punch to the stomach. His breath caught in his throat. He had known there was something about Lena that didn't quite fit, but this was something far more complicated, far more dangerous than he had anticipated. He swallowed hard, trying to process the information. "You're running from the law?" he asked, his voice tight. Lena nodded slowly, then reached for the pen again, writing carefully. "I had no choice. I loved him, but he dragged me into a world I couldn't escape. When I found out the truth, I had to leave." The silence. It wasn't just from trauma. It was my way of protecting myself from the memories, from everything that came with him. David stood frozen, the weight of her words sinking in. Lena was not the innocent, mute woman she had appeared to be. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance, she was a fugitive, a woman trying to outrun a past that was dark and dangerous. And now she was here, in his home, with his son, hiding from something much larger than anything David had ever imagined. "I came here to heal," Lena wrote on the notepad, her handwriting now shaky. "I came here not just for Max, but for myself. I thought maybe being in a peaceful place could help me forget. Help me start over." She paused, her hand resting on the pen. "But I can't escape it. The past always follows." David stood still, his mind swirling. He could feel his pulse quicken, the tension between them palpable. He had spent so much time focusing on Max, on the way his son was healing, that he hadn't once stopped to think about Lena's own wounds. He hadn't considered that Lena might be running from something more than just her silence. She was running from a life that was far more dangerous and complicated than anything he could have imagined. He could feel the weight of her story pressing down on him, the gravity of what she had shared. There was no going back from this. Lena had revealed her truth, a truth that no longer seemed as simple as the quiet woman who had come to help his son. But there was something else in the air, something unspoken. The room felt different now. There was a distance between them, a boundary she had drawn long before, and yet David couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of protectiveness for her. She was so much more than the quiet woman he had assumed her to be. And now, more than ever, he felt a need to protect her, to help her heal. "I'm sorry," David whispered, almost to himself. The words felt hollow, but they were all he could say. He didn't know what else to offer. He didn't know what to do with this truth. Lena's eyes softened, and for the first time since David had known her, there was a flicker of vulnerability in her gaze. She wasn't just the strong, silent figure anymore. She was a woman broken by her past, seeking solace in a place where she could no longer hide from it. "I didn't want you to know," Lena wrote. "I didn't want to bring this into your life." David felt a pang in his chest. He could understand her fear, but now that the truth was out, now that the walls had been broken down, he knew there was no turning back. The silence between them was no longer a protective barrier. It was a bridge between two souls, both trying to heal, both running from something they could never outrun. As Lena's hand hovered over the notepad, David made a decision. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Together. We'll figure it out." And for the first time, Lena's eyes glistened with something more than fear. There was hope. The evening had been heavy with the quiet rumblings of a storm in the distance, a promise of rain that loomed just beyond the horizon. Inside the house the air was thick with tension. Max's room was dark, save for the pale light of his desk lamp, which illuminated a half-finished canvas. He stared at it blankly, his brush hovering mid-air, but the strokes he had once applied so confidently now seemed distant, foreign to him. Nothing in his world seemed clear anymore. His thoughts were consumed by the revelation he had overheard just hours ago, the truth about Lena, the woman who had come into his life like a breath of fresh air, the one person who seemed to understand him without words, had been hiding something, something dark, something dangerous. It was all too much to process. He had always known there was something about Lena, something elusive that kept her at arm's length. But now the silence between them felt heavier than ever, like 1,000 unspoken truths between them, suffocating the connection they had started to form. Max had gone over it 1,000 times in his head since hearing Lena's confession. The whispers of her past, her involvement with a man who had ties to the law, her flight from a life she wanted to forget, kept circling his mind. He had trusted her. He had opened himself up to her in a way he hadn't done for anyone else in years. And now, that trust felt like it had been shattered. He had to know why. He had to hear it from her. Lena sat in the small sitting room, the place she had made her own within the house, where she often retreated when the weight of everything became too much. It was a room filled with soft pillows and warm light, a sanctuary where she tried to make herself feel safe. But tonight, even the familiar comfort of the space couldn't calm the storm brewing inside her. Her heart was heavy with regret. She hadn't meant to get this close to Max, to let herself feel anything for him. But somewhere along the way, his kindness, his sincerity had slipped past the walls she had carefully built. She had allowed herself to fall into something she knew she couldn't control, something that terrified her. She had never wanted to be vulnerable again. And yet, here she was, torn between the fear of losing Max and the pain of what her past could mean for him. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching, Max's footsteps, slow and deliberate. The weight in her chest grew heavier as the door to the room opened, and Max stepped inside. His eyes were dark, full of something Lena couldn't quite place, but it wasn't the warmth she had grown accustomed to. It was hurt. Disappointment. Max's voice cut through the silence, low but charged with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me, Lena?" His words were thick, weighed down by a betrayal that felt raw in the air between them. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Lena froze, her hands trembling as they rested in her lap. She hadn't wanted this moment. She hadn't wanted to face him like this, to see the hurt she had caused him. But she knew this moment was inevitable. Max took a step closer, his jaw tight with frustration. "I trusted you," he continued, his voice breaking on the last word. "I let you in. And now I feel like everything we've shared has been a lie." Lena's heart sank, and she fought to keep her composure. She could see the pain in his eyes, the confusion and betrayal that had overtaken the tenderness they had shared. She couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to explain herself. But she didn't need to. She had always found a way to communicate without speaking, even when it hurt. She stood up slowly, her movements measured, and reached for the notepad that always seemed to be her escape. She wrote, her hand shaking just slightly as she formed the words. "I never wanted to lie to you, Max. I never wanted to hurt you, but I had to protect myself." She turned the notepad around, holding it out for him to see. Max's gaze flickered from her to the words, but he didn't move to take it. Instead, his face tightened even further, his fists clenched at his sides. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You came into my life like you were meant to be here. You helped me find a part of myself I thought I'd lost. And now you're telling me you were hiding from your past? From me?" His voice broke, and he exhaled sharply, his eyes not meeting hers. "You made me feel like I could trust you, Lena." Lena felt a tear slip down her cheek before she could stop it. She wiped it away quickly, as if to erase the vulnerability she had never wanted him to see. She wrote again, her hand steady now, each word a weight on her heart. "I wanted to stay silent. I thought I could keep you at a distance, protect you from my darkness. But you broke through. Your kindness, your warmth. I couldn't push it away. And now I'm afraid." Max stood motionless, the silence between them stretching like a canyon that neither of them could bridge. Lena could see the conflict in his eyes, the part of him that still wanted to believe her, still wanted to reach out and pull her back from the brink of whatever this was between them. But there was also something else. Hurt, a kind of disillusionment she hadn't anticipated. "I'm scared too," Max said, his voice soft but laced with pain. "I'm scared that you're going to disappear again, that you're going to shut me out, just like everyone else does. I don't know how to keep going if you're not honest with me." Lena closed her eyes, her chest tightening with the weight of his words. She had never wanted to drag him into her mess, into the nightmare of her past. But she had, and now the possibility of losing him felt like an unbearable weight. She reached for his hand, hesitantly, almost afraid that he would pull away, but to her surprise, he didn't. Instead, his fingers curled around hers, his grip strong but uncertain. "I never meant for you to feel this way," she wrote slowly, her words coming out in a quiet flood. "I never meant to make you feel like you weren't enough, but my past is a shadow that I can't outrun, and I'm afraid that if you really knew everything about me, you'd leave." Max exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair, his face crumpling with emotion. "Lena, I don't care about your past. I care about you, but you have to let me in. You have to let me help you." For a long moment, Lena stood there, feeling the weight of the silence. She had spent so many years hiding from the world, shutting herself off from anyone who might try to love her. And now, standing here in front of Max, she realized that she couldn't keep doing this. She couldn't keep running. "I'm scared of letting anyone in again," Lena finally whispered, her voice breaking. "But you make me want to try." Max's eyes softened and he stepped forward, pulling her gently into an embrace. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she allowed herself to lean into him, to feel his warmth and his steady breath. She had never imagined this moment, this connection, and yet here it was raw, vulnerable, and real. "I won't leave," Max whispered, his voice filled with certainty. "I'll be here, whatever happens." And for the first time in years, Lena allowed herself to believe him. The rainy morning felt quiet and reflective as David sat by the window, lost in thought. The wealth he had built seemed meaningless compared to the fractured relationship he had with his son Max. His mind kept returning to Lena, the young woman whose presence had slowly bridged the emotional distance between them. She had done for Max what David had failed to do, offer understanding and healing. David realized that if he wanted to rebuild their family, he had to embrace vulnerability and connect on a deeper level. Max, alone in his room, stared at the portrait of Lena he had painted. It was his way of processing the past few weeks, the emotional growth he had undergone, and the love he had begun to feel for Lena. The truth about her painful past had shaken him, but it also helped him see her not as someone defined by her trauma, but as a person worthy of love. The sound of a soft knock broke his thoughts. His father entered, looking at the painting before speaking. "I've been thinking about us," David said. "I haven't been the father I should have been. I let my work get in the way, and I'm sorry." Max, touched by his father's sincerity, replied, "I get it, Dad. But we need more than just your work. We need you here." David nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I will be. I promise." That evening, the three of them stood together at Max's first art exhibition. The walls were filled with his paintings, each one a reflection of his personal journey and Lena's influence on him. The quiet strength of the woman who had entered their lives as a mute maid had now become a central part of their healing. David realized that healing was not about perfection, but about showing up, accepting one another, and moving forward. Max, Lena, and David had all found a way to heal together. For the first time, David felt at peace, knowing they had found something real. They had built a family. "This is just the beginning," Max said, looking at Lena. David, his heart full, nodded. "Yes, it is." And for the first time he felt whole again. So, through many challenges and surprises, the three of them finally found a true connection, a sincere love, and a family built on understanding and deep affection. The wounds of the past are no longer a burden, but a valuable lesson for them to grow up and be happier. They have proven that love does not need to be expressed in words, but sometimes just presence, patience, and understanding are enough. Thank you for following this story to the end. If you like emotional stories and profound life lessons like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos. Please share this story with your friends and relatives and leave your comments below the video.